They were smiling before the cameras found them, the kind of easy, open smiles you get on a cool Highland morning when the heather is still damp and the air tastes like pine. A short drive from Balmoral, past fields that pretend time never learned to run, the King and Queen rolled up to Crathy Kirk with the windows framing tweed and tartan, a feather catching the light like a wink. Sunday service here is not performance, it is ritual, a small stone anchor for a family that lives on a moving stage. Charles's three-piece tweed looked as though it had been pressed by the wind itself. Camilla's teal red as cheerful, not loud. It was the look of two people who have learned to borrow stillness where they can find it. And yet, even in this pocket of quiet, a larger story pressed its face to the glass. The mail's whisper had already travelled north, early talks to bring father and younger son back into a single public frame, for the first time in 6 years. Not a staged handshake in a corridor no one recognizes, not an awkward crosspath on the edge of a service where the cameras are forbidden to zoom, the real thing, a deliberate moment designed to say, without speechwriters, that the door is not bolted. Highland mornings are skilled at disguising weather, but even the most innocent Sunday can carry thunder if you know where to listen. The smiles said good spirits. The subtext said we're thinking. It helps that the week behind them was a floodlit masterpiece of statecraft. Windsor swallowed a roaring helicopter and exhaled choreography. The King played host at a banquet that turned politics into oak and crystal. The Queen moved rooms the way a good stage manager moves notes. The airs carried the opening beats as if born to call time. The visit's afterglow had barely faded when the sovereign's profile appeared in a church window in Aberdeenshire, softened by the same light that made his mother's summers look eternal. That contrast, global pomp, local pew, does something useful to a narrative. It shows rank catching its breath. It shows that big doors can open from small thresholds. Into that soft frame slipped the harder facts of the family's last few weeks. A private tea at Clarence House, 55 minutes long, with no third chair and no communiques, long enough for a first truth, short enough to be safe. A 4-day swing through the causes that shaped a younger man with a different name, Wellchild, a Diana Award room filled with kids who carry courage like a banner, a handful of meetings that didn't leak because the point was the meeting, not the mention. The hug with Colleen Harris was the kind of footnote insiders remember. Old loyalties, intact, old manners, unforgotten. He left the country the way he likes to leave a tense room, quietly, quickly, purpose in front of him, rumor behind, and still the simplest line carried the most weight. He loved being back. That is not a policy. It is a pulse. So what would it mean to move from a closed-door hour to a moment that can stand the open air? You don't script reconciliation. You script the conditions under which it can survive a lens. The safest version is almost boring, something anchored in memory, not controversy, something with no speeches and 1,000 eyes for logistics, something that lets a public see 2 generations share a duty that doesn't belong to either of them alone. A wreath at a chapel both associate with home more than ceremony. A charity room where conversation looks like work and work looks like kindness. A bench in a garden where the point is not that they sat, but that nobody else had to move to make space. You don't begin with balcony. You begin with plausible. There are, unavoidably, obstacles that have nothing to do with feeling and everything to do with physics. Optics can't be tricked, they have to be earned. The heir's red line, no accidental adjacency that reads as endorsement, still holds, because the brand he stewards cannot afford to be borrowed without permission. The younger son's line, no performance dressed up as forgiveness, holds too, because his new life cannot be asked to masquerade as his old one to soothe a news cycle. The court's line, no security improvisation, ever, sits under both like bedrock. And yet, within those non-negotiables, there is room for invention. The family has done this before, found a way to put people who care about each other into a room that won't punish them for proving it. You could feel that architecture in miniature on the day the King and Queen stepped out at Crathy. The congregation knows how to hold a gaze without intruding. The press pack, smaller than London's and better at silence, kept its distance and its manners. Camilla's quick look to the side as she adjusted her scarf read like a silent head count. Are we all in place? Are the moving parts quiet? Is the exit clear? Charles's expression, as he lifted a hand to the familiar faces who have aged alongside him through 6 decades of summers, had that softened focus he gets when adulthood and childhood briefly overlap. This is where he is not sovereign first. This is where the walk to a wooden door can feel like relief. But the work of unfreezing a story happens away from stone and feathers. It lives in diaries and in the pauses between bookings. It lives in calls that begin with practicalities and end with "we'll see." Senior aides were glimpsed together months ago not because the palace wanted to tease, but because real progress always starts with people who know how to get a room right. The next steps will look like that: calendar lines in pencil, options with 3 fallback plans, a quiet check on whether the rumor tide is rising or falling in a given week, a firm refusal to let any attempt be held hostage by a pre-written narrative. If this is to happen, it has to belong to them first and to us later. None of this means the brothers are ready to stand shoulder to shoulder and let the country turn their faces into symbols again. The gulf is not a misunderstanding. It is a chasm carved by choices and words that do not fit neatly back into closets when seasons change. A public moment between father and son does not erase that ledger, it simply declines to let it be the only book on the table. That is why the location matters. Scotland offers a softer lens. Crathy, Birkhall, paths that twist through trees that have held 3 generations of private sentences, these are places with muscle memory. They turn famous men into sons without asking permission from the front page. It's also why momentum matters. The state visit staged a monarchy operating at absolute precision. The Sunday appearance staged a couple capable of putting their shoulders down without looking diminished. The transition from one register to the other is the monarchy's party trick, and it is exactly the trick a careful rapprochement requires: move from the roar to the whisper without losing your footing. The king's good spirits were not an accident. They were a signal that he believes the institution has enough in reserve to risk a human step. And still, it will come down to things so small they wouldn't interest anyone if these people had different names. Where does the car stop, so no lens is tempted to read too much into a silhouette in the same frame? Which door opens first, so no one is forced into choreography that can be cut to look like retreat? Who else is in the room? And do they have the kind of faces the public instinctively trusts? Are there children nearby later that day, so the conversation can end on a sentence about schools instead of history's sharp edges? Reconciliation, when it is real, gets built out of answers to questions like these. The other truth hovering over Crathy is unromantic and unavoidable: time. The king looks well, and there was warmth in that, a quiet rebuttal to the worst worries of earlier months. But time is still the country's most persuasive diplomat. It softens positions without shaming them. It persuades proud men to make smaller, kinder decisions because the calendar asked and the heart agreed. A first public moment with his younger son is not a grand concession. It is an investment, that the institution is sturdier when its human seams show, that a sovereign is stronger when he is also allowed to be a father, that the public will reward proof of love with patience for silence where detail is owed to no one. Even the language the king used with his American guest last week knew the value of tone. Special relationship can sound like porcelain when overhandled. Here it sounded used, sturdy, ready for more. He called the days long, and you could hear in that word a man who has learned to make time carry him instead of the reverse. Those are the muscles that a smaller moment will require. Hold the gaze. Let the first camera take the picture it came for. Then step sideways into privacy before the next lens writes a second story on your face. If this is indeed the plan, if a room is being cleared somewhere for a brief, public moment that doesn't pretend to be more than it is, the smartest thing about it is that it doesn't ask for our permission. It asks for our patience. It asks us to let a photograph be a photograph, not a coda. It asks us to accept that a family is allowed to take one low-stakes step without being dared into 10 more before supper. The king and queen arriving at Crathy in good spirits is not proof of anything beyond this. They know how to carry a morning lightly when the afternoon carries weight. It's a start. The rest will look like small mercies. Another tea that doesn't leak. A garden event where 2 men can stand in the same sun without the air crackling. A quiet call to explain that the next attempt will happen somewhere even less interesting to paparazzi. A summer afternoon at Balmoral where the loudest thing is a dog, and no one thinks to ask who else is in the next room. If those sound like anticlimaxes, that's because we've been overtrained to expect spectacle. What actually heals in families is the ordinary. What actually lasts is the plain. By the time the king and queen stepped back into the car outside the kirk, the smiles were still there, the kind that leave creases and do not care. A hand lifted to the small crowd. Tweed against leather, feather against glass, a brief exchange with the minister that looked like two people agreeing that a sermon's best work happens after it's over. The Highlands are good at sending people out with their shoulders lower. The road back to Balmoral is good at hiding reporters behind curves. Somewhere, in the same air, the idea kept breathing. A public minute that doesn't pretend to be a miracle. A minute that proves the hinge still turns.